In Chapter 23, we're going to be learning the first aorist, both the active and the middle. The previous chapter we learned the second aorist, so it's time to learn the first aorist. Most Greek verbs have first aorist, so it's an important chapter, but it's a short chapter and an easy chapter because the first aorist is very easy to form. So it's not going to take a long time to get through this chapter, okay? In terms of meaning, remember that the difference between first and second aorist has nothing to do with meaning. Whether it's a first or second aorist, the aorist describes an action that normally occurs in the past and is undefined in its aspect. The difference between first and second aorist has to do with how you form them, okay? And there's two basic things going on in a first aorist. First of all, first aorists use a tense formative. So we had a sigma as a tense formative in the future. Well, the tense formative for a first aorist is sigma alpha. So you will learn to see that saw and it'll just bounce out at you and you'll be able to tell, this is an aorist, no big deal. The other thing that's kind of nice about first aorist is that if a verb has a first aorist, then the root and the present tense stem and the aorist tense stem are generally all the same. No variations at all. So pretty straightforward. So how do you form a first aorist? Okay. Well, you form them with an augment, an aorist active tense stem, a tense formative, which is the sa, and then secondary active personal endings. And you end up with a form like elusamen. See that you've got an augment there, the sa, you got stuff bouncing out at you. These are very easy forms to identify. When you look at the full paradigm, it's elusa, elusas, eluse with a new movable, elusamen, elusate, elusan. You can see the augment and the tense formative telling you it's an aorist. When you look at the personal endings, you can see that for the most part, they are secondary active endings, and for the most part, look just like the endings that you have on the imperfect. The one big difference is first person singular, though, isn't it? There's no personal ending used in the first person singular of a first aorist. It's elusa, not elusan with the new, which is what you might expect from an imperfect. Okay, this is just one of the oddities of the first aorist system. You'll also notice another oddity that in the third person singular, the tense formative sa has gone to se, sigma epsilon. I'm assuming that's because Greeks wanted to be able to distinguish in form the first from the third person singular. But other than that, these things are very straightforward. This may be a good time to start your exception list. And all that an exception list is a one page. Maybe you'll fill out the front and back if you write large. But an exception list is just a list of the exceptions to the rules. The rules that I've shown you are going to carry you through and explain almost all the forms you have to know. But every once in a while, this is going to be a little odd thing out, and you kind of want to put all those odd things out in one place so you can remember them. That's what the exception list is for. So the first thing is going to be the first person singular of a first aorist. There's no personal ending, and it's elusa, not elusan. Okay? The second thing you're going to put is in the third person singular, the tense formative goes from sa to se. But again, there are so many third person singular aorist forms that this is not going to give you a problem, but you'll want to write it down in your exception list. The other thing you may want to write down is this. Where else do you see a sigma right after the tense stem? It's in the future, isn't it? But when you're in the future, what always follows the sigma? Well, it's a connecting vowel, isn't it? It's always omicron or epsilon. So when you see that sigma after the stem, you need to look over and see what the vowel is. And if it's sa with an omicron or se with an epsilon, then in all cases but one, you're in the future. If it's sigma alpha, you're always in an aorist, okay? Now that one exception, of course, is the third person singular. But again, you're going to see this so often, it's not going to be hard. So that's the beginning of your exception list, and you should be writing that down, or perhaps someplace in the grammar you could write it down. Okay, let me give you 4 odds and ends we need to cover when it comes to first aorist, and they're pretty, for the most part, they're straightforward. The first has to do with contract stems. Contract stems behave perfectly regularly. That final vowel is going to lengthen before the tense formative blissfully regularly, okay? So agapao, for example, in this aorist is agapesa. So there's that eta before the sigma. Second odds and end has to do with stems ending in stops. When you take that sigma, the tense formative, and put it up against the stop, the same kind of changes that we saw in the future are going to be happening in the aorist. So again, perfectly regular for you. So you have the verb blepo. When it goes to the aorist, it's eblepsa. Okay. In terms of velar stems, you have a verb like tarasso, and you know that asso words actually have stems ending in a velar. Velar plus sigma form a xi, and so the aorist of tarasso is etaraxa, sigma alpha. And when it comes to dental stems, remember the dental drops off before the sigma. And so if you have a verb like baptizo, you know that the root is actually a dental stem, right? It's baptid. The dental drops out before the sigma, and you get the aorist ebaptisa. Now, that's an interesting word. You may look at that and you go, oh, there's an augment. I'm going to cut it off, and there's a sigma alpha. That's the tense formative. And you have baptio, and you go, look, I don't know any word baptio. So you go looking in a dictionary. Well, that's why you got to know your roots, okay? So when you see the ebaptisa, you can recognize it's a dental stem, but the dental's dropped out. But contract stems and stems in a stop are very regular in the first aorist, so that's not a problem. The third odds and end has to do with second aorist stems with first aorist endings. Now, fortunately, this only occurs with a few words, and I've listed them in the grammar. But there's two that you really need to know. Well, you need all of them, but you really need to know two of them. Normally, the second aorist is apon with an omicron, but sometimes you'll find apan with an alpha. Also, the form aelthon. Normally, it's the omicron, which is the normal second aorist ending, but sometimes you'll find aelthan with an alpha. Those are just first aorist endings being stuck on second aorist stems. But just be aware of them. It shouldn't be a problem, okay? The third odds and end is a little bit bigger of a deal, and it has to do with liquid aorists. Now, liquid stems only affect us in the future in the aorist, so once we've learned this, we're done, okay? The oddity of a liquid aorist is that the tense formative is not sigma alpha, the tense formative is an alpha. See, liquids just don't like the sigma, and they're going to get rid of them. So the tense formative for a liquid stem in the aorist is going to be the simple alpha. So let's take a look at that. A liquid aorist, which is a first aorist, is formed with an augment, the aorist active tense stem, the tense formative alpha, and then secondary active personal endings, and you get a form like emenamen. Now there's something else though going on in this form. The lexical form is meno with an epsilon, but when you get into the aorist, that epsilon, due to ablaut, has changed to epsilon iota, and you get emenamen. Well, I thought you said this was the first aorist. Well, it is, but this is the one time that the root is regularly modified in the formation of a first aorist tense stem, and that is with liquids. So it's real common in liquids to have some kind of stem vowel change when you're in the aorist. But that's actually a blessing, okay? You're reading along in an inflected form, and you see emenamen, and you take off the augment, you take off the endings, and you end up with main, mu epsilon iota nu, and you go, is this the present tense stem? You go, oh, no. So even if you haven't caught that it's a first aorist liquid, the change in the vowel should alert you that you're outside of the present tense system. So the change is actually a blessing, but that does happen often with liquids in the first aorist, okay? So take a look at the paradigm. Amena, amenus, amena with a new movable, emenamen, emenate, emenan. And when you compare them to a non-liquid first aorist, you can see that they're just the same thing. In the appendix for BBG, there is a list of all the liquid verbs, so you may want to go take a look at them. You don't know all of them now, but you may want to go take a look at it and kind of look at the patterns and just to make sure they make sense to you, okay? All right. Enough for the first aorist active. Let's learn the first aorist middle. Well, the first aorist middle is formed with an augment, aorist active tense stem, tense formative, sa, and secondary middle passive personal endings. And you have elusamen. Now, luo may not have been the best choice for this paradigm because all the middles that I've shown you so far are deponent, and luo isn't deponent, but It's short and it fits on the screen, so I used it, okay? So in the paradigm, I'm going to give you active meanings as if luo were a middle deponent. It's not, but you understand. So we get elusamen, eluso, elusata, elusamatha, elusasta, elusanta. And you can compare it to the second aorist middle of ginamai, and you can see that they're consistent all the way through, except for the second person singular. And this is just a change due to contractions. There's a different set of vowels contracting in a first aorist middle. The sigma of the personal ending has dropped out between the alpha of the tense formative and the omicron of the personal ending. And so you have sigma alpha omicrons contract to omega, and you get eluso for the second person singular. But other than that, things are what you would expect. Well, that was a nice short chapter, wasn't it? Not a whole lot there, just a tense formative, and that's about it. So in summary, let's see what we've learned in this chapter. We saw that first and second aorists don't differ in meaning. They both describe an action normally occurring in the past, always undefined in aspect. The only difference is one of formation. In order to form a first aorist, you have an augment, the first aorist tense stem, the sigma alpha as a tense formative, and then the secondary active or the secondary middle personal endings. We saw that contract verbs behave themselves, lengthening that final vowel before the tense formative. We saw that stems ending in a stop are rewritten just like they were in the future, so no big deal there. And the one oddity of a liquid aorist stem is that it uses the tense formative in alpha, and the root is sometimes modified, usually I would guess, in the formation of the aorist tense stem. And so that change in vowel will help tell you you're in the aorist and not in the present. We have 3 new lines on the master verb chart. The first aorist active is formed with an augment, aorist active tense stem, sa as a tense formative, secondary active personal endings, and we have elusa. The liquid aorist active, which is the first aorist, is formed with an augment, aorist active tense stem, alpha as its tense formative, secondary active personal endings, and we have emena. And we also learned the first aorist middle, which has an augment, aorist active tense stem, sa for a tense formative, secondary middle passive personal endings, and we get elusamen. So that wasn't very hard, was it? No, all right. Well, let's learn the vocabulary for this chapter so you can get into the exercises. Aperchomai. I depart. Archomai. I begin. Grapho. I write. Dia. Therefore, for this reason. Doxazo. I praise, honor, glorify. Dunamis. Dunameos. Hey. Power, miracle. Keruso. I proclaim, preach. Pino. I drink.